Thank you. Listen, my name is Mark Valencia. I'm a pensioner. I have a question for Alex Metelica. You didn't mention the enormous resources of gas clathrates under the continental slope. I'd like you to elaborate a little bit on that and consider how that might change your projections and your conclusions.
Testing? Oh, great. So the question was about gas hydrates. So for those who don't follow this, gas hydrates are basically crystalline structures of methane, natural gas, that are found all around the world. There's massive deposits of natural gas hydrates everywhere, trillions and quadrillions of cubic feet of gas, and many of those are in the South China Sea. So the question is, how does that impact estimates of reserves and production in the South China Sea? So there's two ways. First of all, that technology is pretty far away from being commercially viable. Japan is taking the lead in developing it and has some interesting pilot projects that they're doing with methane gas hydrate production. And China has a research center devoted to studying these. But so far, it's not commercially viable of a technology. Our agency doesn't estimate that we'll see commercial production of these resources for maybe 50 years. So basically, in the short and medium term, they're not going to be significant production in the South China Sea. Second of all, the gas hydrates are in lots of different places around the world. So once the commercial technology becomes available, then it becomes a question of risk profiling. Where's the cheapest, less risky gas hydrates to develop?
Other questions? Yes, sir.
Good morning. Lee Cordner from University of Adelaide in Australia. I have two questions. Firstly, to Alex the Younger. For many years, I attended conferences like this where we fretted about world peak oil and I guess gas energy more broadly. But the scenario that you've outlined indicates a significant shift perhaps in that. So I'd appreciate your remarks on where we now see the future of oil going forward. And the second question is for Alex, the slightly elder. You indicated that you lamented, if you like, that the levels of understanding and cooperation between navies and the vast merchant fleets were not as good as they needed to be. However, I guess my anecdotal and experiential perception is that that has actually probably increased or improved in recent years because of the anti-piracy operations and because of the enforcing UN Security Council sanctions in the Middle East, Persian Gulf region, etc., where I think certainly in my Navy I have a perception that we've had a lot more to do with the merchant marine than probably in the previous decades. So I'd appreciate your remarks on that. Thank you.
Well, can you hear me? Yeah. As the first gentleman alluded to, I am also a pensioner, an elderly gentleman on a fixed income trying to do his civic duty here. The example that you usually on the piracy in Somalia is a great example of military and merchant cooperation. I think what's happening, though, when you look at it from a long way, is that if you look at what the British are doing with their MTOs, they tend to focus on talking to other British ships, or when you talk about what the Dutch or the German NCAG, the NCAG groups in Germany do, they tend to talk to German flag people. If you look at what the mission of the US Fifth Fleet, one of the things up in their mission is they want to protect oil routes and by protecting US flag shipping. But there is actually not a single US flag oil tanker commercial oil tanker in the Gulf. Those tankers that they do have are supplying the Navy. And so what I'm looking for is more practice before the event happens, you know, if you look at the piracy in Somalia, some wonderful things were happening there and have happened there with best practices and the industry working together with the Navy. That could have been started before. And I'm just suggesting with today's world and the terrorism, and I'm specifically using the T word here, but the threat of terrorism to the ships, we should be starting to work now together across the nations, you know, and with individual navies talking to ships that perhaps are not of their flag state, and just getting more interaction and actually getting more Navy people on board the vessels, as the Brits used to do many years ago, but they stopped. I believe they still have the occasional admiral that goes on the Queen Elizabeth, but they used to have a lot of more junior people visiting oil tankers and things like that. So a good point, and I do think there are highlights on the cooperation. Somalia is one of them. I think the Malacca Straits, Singapore is one of them. What's happening in West Africa today on this terrible robbery/piracy thing in West Africa, where the Ghana government and the Nigerians, the Americans, the Brits, the Danes are all manning up that little center there in Ghana. So I agree there are good things happening. My plea is we need to get back to a little more mariner to mariner, a little more hands-on ships, and a little more perhaps look at the tactics and how we do things so that people can get trained.
So peak oil. Peak oil is almost kind of a philosophical term in some sense. It's of course a geologic inevitability that there's a limited amount of hydrocarbons in the world. But what we look at is basically three things: price, technology, and use patterns. So traditionally, oil is used in a lot of different things, from power plants to cars to all sorts of stuff. Increasingly, oil is mostly used in the transportation sector, both vehicles, ships, planes. So we're not seeing a lot of oil use outside of some countries, particularly Saudi Arabia, in power generation, for example. Most of that oil has switched away and now is coal or natural gas or renewables. So going forward, most of the growth in oil demand comes from transportation sector, which until now, there's pretty much no better fuel for transportation than oil. It's the reality. But what's interesting is if you look at reserves, so we mentioned reserves previously, economic and technically recoverable. Reserves have risen every year for a long time. How is it that we keep producing oil, but the reserves of oil keep rising? And that's because there's new technology that comes online, and the price changes that makes previously uneconomic oil now economic. And so because of that, looking at dynamics of growth, particularly in the transportation sector, growth in technology, and growth in regional patterns, our projections say that there is enough oil to supply that met demand. There will be price increases though. The price of oil will go up. As the price of oil goes up and technology becomes better, then we start to see more and more previously uneconomic areas of oil now come into production.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, sir. Right there.
Hello. Alan Breakspear. I'm a retired government and business intelligence analyst, but my question isn't directly in that regard. I failed yesterday to get a reasonable answer to a question about intelligence, so I won't go there again. First, I want to congratulate the panelists. This was an outstanding set of presentations. I found it very useful. I want to talk to Alex, as he called himself, the younger. I try and keep track of critical infrastructure protection activities as they're going on around the world. My sense is that what you're talking about of military and commercial cooperation is a highlight in that area. Many of the other sectors of critical infrastructure protection have had great difficulty getting going. It's very expensive. You guys are obviously willing to spend some money. You're diverting ships and so on. So congratulations on that. The one area that I thought would appreciate if the panel had spent a little more time on is the political aspects of the economic factors that you've all talked about. Here in BC, 90% of the economy is in the oil and gas sector. 90% of the economy is in the oil and gas sector. 90% of the economy is in the oil and gas sector. 90% of the economy is in the oil and gas sector. 90% of the economy is in the oil and gas sector. 90% of the economy is in the oil and gas sector. 90% of the economy is in the oil and gas sector. 90% of the economy is in the oil and gas sector. 90% of the economy is in the oil and gas sector. 90% of the economy is in the oil and gas sector. 90% of the economy is in the oil and gas sector. 90% of the economy is in the oil and gas sector. 90% of the economy is in the oil and gas sector. 90% of the economy is in the oil and gas sector. 90% of the economy is in the oil and gas sector. 90% of the economy is in the oil and gas sector. 90% of the economy is in the oil and gas sector. 90% of the economy is in the oil and gas sector. 90% of the The future balancing of the provincial budget depends on pipelines, which are internationally controversial for oil, and the exploitation of LNG, which at the moment its latest risk factor is that Malaysia's Petronas is threatening to pull out of a combined investment. I recently traveled in a good part of northern BC along the coast, and the opposition to tankers is tangible. It's going to be a major political factor. So in addition to anything you might want to give us about the politics of politico-economic factors of the things implied by the things you're talking about, I'd be glad to have that. But I'd also, I guess, wouldn't mind a couple of words about how well-founded are the public environmental concerns about tanker traffic on the BC coast.
Well, it was really nice going to dinner last night and seeing some demonstrators demonstrating against you guys. It was very relaxing for me because I'm used to the other way around, as being the person demonstrated for. To take the last part of your question first, how well founded is the public's concern? Well, unfortunately for me, you have to say that, and I know these things sound like ancient history now, that those occasions, the Exxon Valdez is an example, there are many of them, I won't name them all, have confirmed in the view of the public that tankers are dangerous, they're oily, and they're dirty, and that everyone on board them is drunk. Well, they're not oily or dirty, but I do go on ships. I go on naval ships sometimes. I go on carriers. One of the pictures was me on the Eisenhower. And I talk to the navigators about the different drivers and why different ships react differently to things. I think today the tanker industry is safer, cleaner than it's ever been before. I know that the highest thing on the master's mind nowadays is not death by terrorist, it's killing birds by oil. And the fear, and and I choose that word carefully, the fear in a master's mind about environmental protection is the biggest thing that gets beaten into him by his company and by the public. If you look at our safety record over the last 10 years, say, it is continuing to improve. Things like the double hulls, which I have to admit the oil industry actually fought against, but the double hulls have had a remarkable effect, and so that minor groundings that still happen aren't the environmental problem that they were. We're becoming more and more focused on not just spilling oil, but emissions from our ships, emissions from our fuel, smoke emissions, noise from our propellers. A lot of people think we're killing the whales. I truly hope we're not, and if we are, I don't mean it. But I think the industry is reacting to the public pressure. The public pressure is, I think, justified. And although I'm an oil industry person, I do believe when we all try and do the right thing, I believe that industry pressure is continuing to force us to focus on environmental protection. It's making our life very difficult. I'll shut up here. Well, let me just give you a story. Our chairman, Ken Dare, about 15 years ago, was asked, and we have an Asian audience here, and he was asked, well, it must be very difficult for you guys working in Asia, working with the Chinese and working with all these other, and working in Africa and working with the Nigerians. And Ken Dare said, my biggest headache is Santa Barbara on the west coast of the US. If you want to deal with people who hate you, that's where you want to go. And that still exists today. There's no way to sugarcoat it. All we can do is continue to get better, to continue to focus on the environment, and to continue to try and get the story out of the fact that these ships, there's more pollution, I hate to tell you, in naval ports than there are in oil docks. If you see a sheen of oil beside one of our tankers, that is a violation and it's a felony against the company and against the master. So if you go to one of your Burnaby refinery there in Canada, you won't see sheens in the water. If you go to certain naval bases around the world, you will. So keep getting the message out. Thanks for the question. I hope that kind of answered it.
Sir, your question.
Dr. Compois, Mr. Metelica, you've provided us with a very good picture of about 2/3 of the economic side of the conflict in the South China Sea. But I think the last third part of it, the fishery, has not been touched. And I think after what you told us, this is more significant than is commonly thought. And the question is actually then for our chairman here, Mr. Lear. Do you think that the true economic roots of conflict might lie in fishery, just as UNCLOS is at least majorly rooted in the cod wars?
If you're talking about fisheries in the South China Sea, most of it is undertaken by neighboring countries, and it's a major source of it's a major source of supply. This will not prevent the shipping lines from crossing in that area. It might lead to more surveillance. It might lead to more care of the pilot and the captains that are crossing over there. But the cost of diverting, especially mega vessels, is prohibitive. If you, as I showed in one of the slides, if you divert an 8,000 container ship by, say, 100 nautical miles, it costs $500,000. And we have analyzed the Baltic Dry Index and how it costs to charter a ship at $50,000 a day. If you divert those ships, I mean, it will have an impact on all the consumers.
Sir, please.
Yes, thank you. I have a question for Alexander Metelica. Alexander Sheldon Duplay from Defense Historical Service in France. My question is about the oil rig in the Chinese offshore oil rig near the Vietnamese coast. What is your interpretation? Is it, because it's a big investment to have built this offshore platform, is it for economic reasons in your view, or is it for political reason that this offshore platform has been dispatched to that location?
So the question was about the offshore platform from several months ago that made news headlines. Based on our analysis, that offshore platform is not in an area of the South China Sea with significant oil or gas potential. Moreover, oil rigs are very expensive and take a long time to set up so that they can start producing oil. So having an oil rig for a few weeks or even a month or two, a location, is not nearly enough time to get any kind of viable commercial production out of it.
Next, please.
Don Emerson, Stanford University. My question follows on the last question. I wonder, Alex, if you could explain for me why there is such a disparity in the Chinese estimates of hydrocarbons and the American ones from the USGS. We know that those Chinese estimates do vary. My impression is that estimates that are coming out of official quarters, the foreign ministry, for example, tend to be even higher than the estimates that are coming out of business entities, SOEs, in China. But basically what strikes me is the dramatic gap between the American estimates, which are so low, and the Chinese estimates, which are so high. Can you explain that discrepancy?
I don't think I can explain the discrepancy, but I can give you some context for it. So one of the difficulties is making sure we're doing apples to apples. So we have to make sure we're talking about reserves, resources, undiscovered, technically recoverable, all these different terms. So it's not always clear what everyone's talking about. If you look at Chinese National Offshore Corporation annual reports, where they actually list reserve estimates by location, their reserve estimates are very similar to ours. So in terms of the companies themselves reporting reserves, there's very little discrepancy. The discrepancy is in not reserves, but resources, so not necessarily economically viable or technically recoverable. So the USGS, the US Geological Survey, has estimates about prices, about technology. If you vary those levers and you say, okay, well, we're assuming a different price, or we're assuming a different level of technology, you can get a different level of technically recoverable resource. There's different probabilities, so we take the median number and say the mean number actually. They might be taking a higher number, a lower probability number. These are just conjectures. In all honesty, I can't tell you because the Chinese estimates don't have a research methodology that we have seen. So we don't have a report that we can compare those numbers to. So the data we have is just based on company reports, industry reports, and the US Geological Survey data that we collect.
Time for one more question. Yes.
Lee Cordner again, and thank you for taking another question from me. Listening to this conversation has caused my strategic analytical brain to tick over and try and join a few dots. So I'm going to make a bit of a statement, and then perhaps this panel, Claude and perhaps Alex Walker might wish to comment, but I suspect what I'm going to raise might be something for others to discuss perhaps later in the conference. What this increasing size, capacity, and number of containers and so on being carried around the world, plus the just-in-time nature of the international maritime trading system has highlighted for me is the incredible challenges this may present for all of us involved in protecting this into the future. And for example, visit board search and seize type operations in the future because of the profound impact that just doing that can have on this system, the costs to the shippers and the global economy more broadly. In my youth, we spent a lot of time in and around the Middle East, stopping, boarding, and searching merchant vessels, and often had to deal with disgruntled captains, merchant captains, who weren't very happy about being held up for a few hours while we discharged our responsibilities under the United Nations Security Council requirements, etc. I'm just wondering, how do you see this unfolding into the future? I mean, for example, I could quite easily foresee a situation where a simple terrorist threat or suggestion of a threat on board the container traffic in this global just-in-time system could cause an enormous disruption if it's not handled very carefully and prudently by the international maritime security community. I see enormous potential changes in the risk profile and, of course, therefore lessons for all of us in how we might deal with this in the future. So I guess I'd be grateful for any comments from you as representatives of the operators and shippers, but I think it's a question that the conference might want to ponder more broadly from the Coast Guard and naval representatives here. Thank you.
Well, can I just start that one, Lee? Thank you for that question. The first thing I want to say, and it goes back to the question that the intelligence gentleman just asked, what is the public perception of our industry? We cannot allow ourselves to fall into the trap of thinking we're big, we're important, we're making a lot of money, therefore we should be above all of that stuff. I think disgruntled captains need to remain disgruntled. I encourage the navies of the world to slow down ships where they have to. Being driven by a schedule alone is a very, very dangerous thing. It's operationally dangerous and it's politically dangerous. Using container ships as an example, more so than tankers, schedule is king. That's a good thing. It also can drive bad behaviors. So whilst schedule, perhaps in an oil tanker, environmental protection is the biggest thing, and a container ship, perhaps schedule is the biggest thing. That drives different behaviors. But my only answer to you is slow them down, stop them, because schedule does not justify lack of safety, schedule does not justify lack of concern, and schedule does not justify lack of doing the right thing for the publics of which you are in the service of.
That's a very good question. What we have observed, and it's something that will affect all the naval forces, is that one, the ship size will continue to increase, especially in containers, for simple reasons of economies of scale. I could provide you with figures on how much a shipping line saves because they have a bigger ship by container carried by kilometer. So this will continue. But what we've observed, and I hinted to that in my presentation, is that there are port expansions being undertaken in the Asian facade of the Pacific. This is not being matched in North America. So you will have a discrepancy. And what might happen is that even though when you're talking about time determinant, and I agree with my colleague, it's not a question of speed. It's just a question of arriving on time, whatever that is. But the naval forces, if trends continue, you might have to survey more often North America's coast rather than the Pacific coast on the Asian side, because you might have more congestion here. So it raises a lot of issue in terms of infrastructure expansion in North America. I mean, Vancouver has to expand, Prince Rupert has to expand, LA has to expand, Seattle has to expand, and so on and so forth. If they don't, then you will have huge ships that will be queuing one behind the other. And it's very important to be aware of this aspect.
So let me conclude this great panel by saying that it's been a real pleasure for me. I've known these three gentlemen for about 36 hours, and I've been very impressed with their expertise as they have shown you here today. I would recommend that with Claude, one thing he did not mention is that his university and the efforts that he leads on the Arctic, they have amazing expertise, and for those nations here interested in the Arctic, to spend some of our remaining conference time talking with Claude about that. With Alex W., the very quiet one on the end, I would recommend for those navies, for those uniformed personnel who are interested in his experience in linking merchanters with mariners, to talk with him about some potential future activities. And finally, with Alex in the middle, I would ask our Chinese representatives to perhaps link him up to your experts so that maybe, Jim, in 2 years, we could have a joint US-Chinese presentation on the data on the South China Sea. I'm not sure if I could lead that panel, but keep me in mind, okay? Thank you very much to our panelists.